We are at Kibenda Tea Estate in Kiambu County in Limuru. And today we want to discuss the history, the long history, if you may, between the African continent and the former Soviet Union, USSR. Those of us who are students of history will remember there was an intimate relationship between the USSR and former freedom fighters. We will also remember that in many institutions of learning in Africa at that time, the USSR was being seen as the breeding ground of Marxism-Leninism, and many young African scholars were attracted to their ideology. We will also remember that the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, spurred many African countries which were under the yoke of Western colonization. And therefore, when we talk about that history, it can never be seen without taking into account that reality. Russia, or the USSR as we knew it in its full before we come to its successor, which is the Russian Federation, was seen as an important ally. And one must ask why. We must remember that African countries, all of them, the 54 of them, were being victimized by the hegemonic European powers. And when the 1917 revolution took place, many African leaders at that time who were in the struggle were taking a cue from it. If you look at South Africa, for example, with the formation of the South African National Native Congress, which later became the ANC, their guiding light was what had happened in the Soviet Union in 1917. And they were telling themselves, we can actually liberate ourselves from this colonial yoke. And if you look at the activities, even in Nigeria with people like Makule, they were taking a cue from these activities at that time. And even as the Soviet Union started to have its hold in international affairs, it was seen very differently from Western countries. First of all, it was not seen as a colonizer, and it was not involved in the scramble for Africa, so that the Soviet Union was not present at Berlin. The Soviet Union did not have any territory that it was claiming. The Soviet Union was seen as the bastion of revolution and the bastion of change which African peoples desired from the colonial yoke. And of course, we know that from 1917, of course, in the First World War, the role of the Soviet Union was not as prominent as it became after the World War II, when the Cold War then came into the arena, and we could very easily talk of a bipolar world, the West and the Soviet Union. So in many ways, when African countries are now involved in the struggle for independence in 1940s through to 1950s and ultimately 1960s, the natural ally was seen to be the Soviet Union for a number of reasons. If you look at the African National Congress in South Africa, many of the freedom fighters were gravitating towards the Soviet Union, not only for ideological reasons, but for support, financial support. And not only for financial support, sometimes military support. And these decisions had to be made. So when you look at South Africa, you'll find that there was a very intimate relationship between the Soviet Union and the African National Congress. And it was not only confined to that. You will note that in the very early days of the struggle in the 1950s, a lot of African freedom fighters were attracted to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was being seen at that time as the leader of the East. And when we talk about Soviet Union, we must also remember at that time that they had great influence in countries such as Hungary, and countries such as Poland, countries such as East Germany. And when the scholarships were being granted, the movement to the East, there were a lot of people from different parts of Africa who then found themselves going to study in Moscow and in St. Petersburg at the behest of the Soviet Union. And that in itself grew naturally because the freedom fighters of the day, and one can name them. One can name Gamal Abdel Nasser. When Gamal Abdel Nasser was overthrowing the monarchy of King Farouk, he inclined toward the Soviet Union, and indeed, when the Aswan High Dam was being built, it is the Soviets who actually financed the building of the Aswan High Dam. And the key was also taken by Kwame Nkrumah. When Ghana regained our independence in 1957, one of the things that happened is that he wanted to build the Akosombo Dam. And of course, at that time, he approached several Western countries. They did not agree. And when he told them, I'm now going to the Soviet Union, then they financed the Akosombo Dam. And that is one of the reasons why Nkrumah was then labeled as a communist. The same label was also borne by Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea, who was very sympathetic to the Soviet style of governance, as was indeed Ahmed Ben Bella. And you will see at that time, because the Soviet Union talked about communism, there was something that was beginning to emerge in Africa called communalism and scientific socialism. And you see it in Nkrumah in Ghana, you see it in Ahmed Sékou Touré in Guinea, you see it in Modibo Keïta in Mali, you see it in Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, you see it in Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, you see it even in Kenya, session of paper number 10 on African socialism. At that time, Professor Malinowski was very strong in Kenya at that time, and even in those days, many people inclined to the whole idea of moving to a governance system which was not purely capitalistic. And you see it with Nyerere. When he talks about the Arusha Declaration, he is much more inclined to the views that are articulated in the Soviet Union, and one may say Marxism-Leninism with some Africanization aspect of it. And later, the Soviet Union becomes a counterweight to a Western world that wants to be dictatorial. They want to tell you what to do. They want to tell you who to be your friend. They want to tell you who to trade with. And many people are saying, but we have regained our independence. Why should we be treated like little children? That question is being asked by Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's being told, oh, you cannot ask for support. But Lumumba says, you have put me in a situation where the Belgians want to remove me from power 9 months after we have regained our independence. They have recruited Mobutu, they have recruited Kasavubu, they have recruited Chombe, and I have asked the UN to assist me, and you don't want to assist me. I'm now asking the Soviet Union to assist me. And of course they say that the danger of communism getting into the heart of Africa must be eliminated, and we now know that the code name used for Lumumba was Satan. And he was referred to Satan because he was seen to have inclined towards the Soviet Union at that time. Later, we also see the Soviet Union involved in the liberation movement. Liberation movements which cannot be financed or cannot be granted arms by other parts of the world, particularly Western Europe. And it is said, I think it is Samora Moises Machel and Robert Gabriel Mugabe who said it, that we who are revolutionaries, we swear by the Kalashnikov, the AK-47. This was the weapon of choice for all the struggle for independence. And you therefore see that the involvement of the Soviet Union in Mozambique through supply of arms. We see the involvement of the Soviet Union even during the Angolan Civil War, when the South Africans and the Americans are involved trying to impose Savimbi. It is the Soviet Union and the Cubans who actually succeeded in ensuring that Angola was not taken over. And it is important that the Soviet Union was not only involved in terms of trying to ensure that African freedom fighters were liberated. In the education arena, after the assassination of Patrice Emery Lumumba in 1961, the Friendship University is then named the Lumumba University, I think, in Moscow. And many Africans then went to study at the Patrice Emery Lumumba Friendship University, courtesy of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapses and the countries then become what we now know them, and after Perestroika and Glasnost, and ultimately you have Russia, Russian Federation is seen as the successor of the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation is seen as the successor of the Soviet Union, and that is why even as we continue in a world that we say is multilateral, you begin to see that many African countries still gravitate towards this Russia, in the understanding there is a nostalgia that we knew that Russia was the anchor of the Soviet Union. We knew that Moscow was a friendly site, and therefore quite a number of countries, even in this day and age, remember the days when the Soviet Union supported the freedom fighting movement. They remember those days when they supported people through education. They remember those days when they sent their technology even in places such as Ethiopia. They remember when they sent their technology in different countries in the continent of Africa. And it is out of that nostalgia that there is what I may call a revival and a renewal of friendship between quite a number of countries and Russia. And one sees it quite evidently in Central African Republic with the new administration. One sees it quite evidently in the recent activities that have taken place in the Sahelian region. And you can see the presence of Russia, or the actual invitation of Russia, by governments in the Sahel region, by governments in Burkina Faso, by governments in Niger, by governments in Mali, by governments in Guinea-Conakry. They are saying, you are our friend in our hour of need. And you are our friend who did not tell us how to behave. You worked with us. We think that you can be a better friend than others who claim they are friends, but they want to tell us how to govern ourselves. And you can now see that that kind of relationship is being anchored upon an old relationship, and the Russians are responding in the context of that history. And the relationship is one that is built, and indeed the relationship between the Soviet Union and now Russia is like a tree which has been watered with the blood of solidarity. And that is why it is intimate, because the Soviet Union was never ever seen as a colonizer, never seen as a people who scrambled and divided Africa, never seen as a parasite that takes Africa's resources, never seen as a country that dictates to Africa, but seen as a friend with whom they can enjoy a symbiotic rather than a parasitic relationship. That is the context of that very long history. Once again, goodbye. We are talking about a relationship that has existed over the decades. One hopes and prays that it remains alive and symbiotic. See you again.